So, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see all of you here. Thank you very much for giving me your time. My name's Tazeeb Rajwani. Some of you might know me, some of you don't know me, but I'm going to be taking you through a very hot topic at the moment. It's called new business models, and we're going to be looking at how to organize for the future. So I want to start off with a kind of broad question, which is the iceberg melting? And this is kind of a very deep analogy in some sense. What I want to reflect on is how are companies out there dealing with turbulent times, and what I want to kind of reflect on is how companies at the moment are managing risk and turbulence threats out there. And it's quite interesting when we look at the mega trends out there right now. The power is shifting, as you know, from west to east, but also I'm noticing a lot of shifts between north to south. A lot of investments are moving towards Africa. We're seeing a lot of banks opening in Kenya. Russian money is coming into Kenya. Chinese money is going into Kenya, into Uganda, Tanzania. East Africa is looking quite robust in terms of investment decisions. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of turbulence, not only in Africa, we're seeing it in Asia, we're seeing it in the UK. And what does it look like? Well, I think a lot of you know what's happening out there. We're seeing a lot of volatility, and the volatility is coming out in many different types of ways. We're seeing volatility coming out from Russia, Ukraine, issues around independence. Glad to see UK still with Scotland today. But we're also seeing Ebola viruses, we're seeing ISIS issues, we're seeing Syria, Libya, and it keeps going on and on. At the same time, we're also seeing shifts coming out in terms of faster data power and data processing. And as a result of all of these different kinds of trends, what we're seeing is that companies are starting to manage things very differently. So my goal in this next 30 minutes is to delve deep into what exactly is happening out there. So let's talk about some interesting things. Let's look at this quiz here. It says here, what percentage of large companies that made up the Fortune 100 list in 1965 are still alive? And look at these numbers, 25%, 35%, 45%, 65%. Some of you out there, I want you to reflect on this. Looking at that Fortune 100 list, how many companies do you think are still alive that were there in 1965, and we're looking at 2014, how many are still alive? And the answer is 35% of those companies are still alive. And what I mean by that is that they either haven't been acquired, they haven't merged, or they did merge at some point, they have been acquired, but they're still kicking away. But what we're seeing is basically sustainability of advantages becoming temporary. So temporary advantages are becoming the norm. And what's going on there, it's pretty straightforward. They're very, very kind of interesting shifts. We're seeing, of course, overconfident boards. We're seeing business models changing. We're seeing continuous improvement happening. But equally, we're starting to see new breeds of competitors coming in. As a result of all these different kinds of trends, we're seeing many sectors under pressure. And as a result of these sectors being under pressure, we're seeing perhaps lots of shifts in terms of advantages. So hyper competition is killing off some companies. We can see from the pictures there, you have BlackBerry in trouble. You can just look at Nokia, which was acquired recently. You can see Motorola that was in trouble. All of these companies had competitive advantages. News Corporation in trouble. You just have to look at the advertising agencies right now. The conversations are all about potentially scaling up or having some sort of mergers or breaking down into smaller groups. Banks are under a lot of pressure. We're seeing oil companies under pressure. We're seeing universities under pressure in terms of new types of courses that are coming out online. So workforces are challenged, and it's not only innovation cycles that are changing. It's not only hyper competition that's changing, but also what we're noticing is problems are coming in from within in terms of leadership. We're seeing leadership problems causing a lot of problems for firms. So overall, employee engagement seems to be low, depressingly low. When we look at these figures from Towers Perrin and Towers Watson, we can just look at some of these figures, you know, from USA, Germany, UK, France, China, India, Japan. What we're seeing is that companies are not highly engaged. We're seeing companies that are moderately engaged to being disengaged. Company employees tend to be struggling to deal with the pressures at work. They seem to be managing different types of stresses, and it seems that there's a lot of stress. And as a result of all this kind of difficulties, internal pressures, external pressures, companies are looking at their business models to create what a lot of you guys are aware of most probably is agility, flexibility. How can you create agility and adaptability into your organizational structures so that you can win in the future those advantages? And there's a lot of work that I've been doing in Cranfield, and also some of the work that's been done in London Business School from Julian Birkinshaw, some really good work from Harvard from Michael Tushman. I'll be building on some of those studies, some of those ideas into this presentation so that hopefully I can give you some food for thought. So what we're noticing is that, as I said to you, management is under a lot of stress because technology is in some sense 15 steps ahead of management. And, you know, I'm starting to see managers challenged in many, many ways. Conversations I had yesterday with some executives that I was running a short course with were telling me, Taz, managers and leaders are not viewed to be as cool or interesting as some other professions out there. And, you know, I just have to ask you, have you ever heard a 10-year-old boy who dreams of growing up to be a manager? I'm sure none of you have heard about that. Maybe some of you can think of kids that want to become Steve Jobs, or they want to become some sort of startup executive, but typically managers are challenged. So as a result of management in some ways not changing, models not changing, ill-informed boards, short-term views, myopic views, rear views that tend to be focused a lot in the past, less on the future, strategy seems to also equally being is developed badly. So we're seeing operational directors having lack of clarity in the direction and scope of where to take companies. So a lot of companies seem to be at the moment under a lot of stress and challenges. So I'm going to kind of take you through what I like to call views building on some very strong studies. So based on a study done by Harter et al. In 2002, what this study basically shows, looking at 7,939 business units, is that they found very positive relationships between a very engaged workforce that has high satisfaction, and then as a result, high outcomes. And you can look at another study done by Fulmer, showed that looking at 100 best companies to work for, the list shows that there's a very strong correlation between positive workforce attitudes and high performance. And then you can look at annual alpha values of 3.5% from 1984 to 2009, built on a study done by Edmund. So all of you right now are saying, Taz, we get the story now, which is that you have hyper turbulence, you have very difficult stresses that are coming out in terms of volatility, and having an engaged workforce works. So you're saying, Taz, we already know this. And I'm going to tell you right now that we know this, but we're still struggling to see companies maintain their advantages. So as a result of looking at lots of studies out there and building on my own research and some work done by Julian Birkinshaw, I'm going to reflect on what's happening. So what I'm seeing right now is that top-down perspectives are being challenged. The kind of traditional way of managing strategy and advantages, which tended to be very top-down in terms of, strategies developed at the top and then it cascades down the ladder, is changing in many ways from looking at the new breeds of companies. So there's new systems of strategy being developed. There are new bottom-up perspectives coming up, and new business models are being created. And these business models are changing very fast. And some of you are asking me, what is a business model? I'm sure you're saying that. It's basically the way you make money, and we're seeing companies rethink value in terms of customers, looking at how companies can change their DNA to be a lot more agile and flexible and faster in their responses to deal with all this volatility, and subsequently creating more of an engaged workforce. So let me take you through what are those kind of key trends that I'm seeing out there at the moment in industry. So the traditional models are changing, and there's strategic choices in new business model design. And what we're seeing is that there are three shifts happening. There's a paradigm shift happening in terms of companies that had scale as one of the core elements of advantages, thinking more specifically now about becoming slightly more flexible. And as a result of that, there are three things that are changing in a lot of firms: coordinating activities, decision-making processes, and defining objectives. And I'll deep dive into these three areas, building on Julian Birkinshaw's work, my work, and I'll take you into these kind of three themes in a lot of detail. So let's talk about coordinating activities, and I'll talk about bureaucracy versus emergence. I'll talk about making decisions in terms of hierarchy and collective wisdom, and I'll talk about defining those objectives, which are about those strategic priorities that companies are looking to develop in terms of strategy, and we'll talk about alignment versus deviation. So it's pretty clear that companies out there are reflecting on changing some aspects of these three things. So let's firstly focus on coordinating activities to get a good idea of what does that mean. So the traditional way of strategy development and business models tended to be very bureaucratic. It was all about standardized rules, procedures, a bit like what you see in General Motors, General Electric, ExxonMobil, very kind of top-down, very bureaucratic in terms of product or service, people, marketing, distribution, administration. And you know, the word bureaucracy is a French word that comes from the word bureau, which is kind of desk or office, and of course the Greek word kratos is the rule of power. And what we're seeing is that bureaucracy is about task architecture and how companies are managing the roles to coordinate from the top down. And looking at this, what we're seeing is actually that's one model of doing business, which is the kind of Exxon, GE, top-down, planning-based, very, very strategic from top to the bottom. But then we're starting to notice a lot more companies starting to adopt this emergence-based strategy, which is very bottom-up. And as a result of that, we're seeing this kind of emergence taking place, and this concept of self-management is becoming more and more embedded in many, many companies out there. So some of you are saying, what does self-management mean? It's basically about self-organizing within the organization's design. And what we're seeing is that firms that want to create more faster decision-making are starting to create structures around self-management. And as a result of that, you're seeing companies that are empowering people at the lower end to be able to make decisions faster without needing to speak to managers. There's a great company there that some of you might not be aware of. It's called Morningstar. If you get an opportunity, you should Google it and watch YouTube videos on Morningstar, which is a company that's very, very successful, high competitive advantage, high performance, incredibly agile. But when you watch and read into this company, Morningstar, which is one of the world's leading tomato companies. Some of you are saying, what, a tomato company? Well, this is a leading company in Los Angeles that sells tomatoes globally. And these tomatoes are of course, moving out very fast. But whenever you ask the maintenance man there or the salesperson, the supply chain executive, who's your boss, they will say we have no boss. Why? Because they are very flat in terms of structure, but everyone is self-managing, self-organized, and they negotiate every day in the morning coordination activities, and they meet each other. So salespeople will talk to marketing people, and they kind of deal with management based on their own initiatives. It's a very fascinating company, but we're seeing companies like Ritz-Carlton learning from Morningstar, Google learning from Morningstar. We're seeing companies like Netflix, Facebook, Instagram, all these kind of interesting companies that started off being very small, adopting some of these aspects of self-organizing. Ritz-Carlton, leading hotel company, has empowered its front desk to make decisions very fast. You know, if somebody's checking out and they didn't spend £2,000 in a minibar or in a restaurant, and some of the food and beverage bills tend to be in kind of the 60,000 mark, 80,000 mark if a royal family from Saudi Arabia is staying in the Ritz-Carlton and they disagree with the front desk can make instant decisions up to like a few $1,000s without needing to speak to anybody. And that's very powerful when you're empowered to make decisions based on your own judgment. You feel that you kind of own some aspect of the business. So that builds on this word of agility, and it really allows companies to coordinate and manage volatility quite well. We're also seeing the way companies make decisions in terms of hierarchy changing. And what I mean by this is that you just have to look at companies. Typically, they were very centralized in structure. You started to see shifts in the kind of early 80s, 90s from being very decentralized to kind of centralized. And typically hierarchies about responsibilities and levels of management. But what we're seeing is that these layers within companies are actually starting to kind of break from being, you know, 7 layers or 8 layers down to kind of the 4 layers, in some cases 3 layers, and in some cases you see one flat layer. And what we're seeing is that one of the biggest obstacles to innovation is the notion of a job description. And it's for sure one of the ways that it narrows an employee's focus and makes them kind of stuck on doing what they do. And it doesn't allow them to use their latent skill set. So as a result, truly innovative companies out there are shifting their business models from away in some sense from that kind of classic job description to more open job descriptions that allow creativity to come in and encourage firms to work on multiple projects and encourage people to work on multiple projects. And those kind of consumer products company, like let's take Innocent, they are very famous for their healthy smoothies. And if you ask the employees, you know, what do you do? A marketing person won't say I do marketing. They'll say I do, you know, HR, I'll do sales. They have a very different philosophy of what their roles are. And that is in some sense quite powerful. So we're seeing hierarchies changing, decision making is becoming a lot more collective. So we're seeing, because of technological shifts, that those collective ideas are becoming more and more embedded in structures of companies. And what we're seeing is companies, again, like Innocent, are able to create innovative products through crowdsourcing. They've created veggie pots and a water line as a result of reconceiving the way the mid-management employees would work. And the decision making is becoming faster. Let's take, for example, some of the big supermarkets out there. They're looking at creating better decision making, and as a result, knowledge sharing platforms are becoming more and more important in some of the companies out there. So if you look at, for example, Walmart, they'll be looking at creating faster structures where people can synthesize data. They could go from, you know, 2.5 petabytes of data, analyzing it, using some sort of solutions to come out with answers and to come out with faster responses. So crowdsourcing inside, outside the company seems to be a big shift happening right now. Technology is driving knowledge sharing. And I have no doubt companies like Burberry, Starbucks, which are leading players in this area, are innovating very, very quickly as a result of being closer to their customer. And we're seeing companies in the early stages of adopting what I like to call these kind of younger generation technologies in terms of social technologies. And we're going to see big shifts into cognitive solutions, and a lot of technologies and companies are adopting cognition. And there's a great classic company in Hong Kong recently that's using an algorithm at the board level to identify areas of investment, and then they're kind of using the technology to do the thinking for them. Now, this is still early stages, and what we're noticing is that a lot of companies are experimenting. And as a result of experimentation, they're discovering new ways of managing. You might like to call it Management 2.0, as Julian Birkinshaw likes to call it, but we're seeing these kind of new patterns emerging, especially from these companies in the technology industry, especially from Silicon Valley, companies like Netflix, some of these, I would say companies like Facebook, that tend to be a lot more about technology orientation with quick decision making, and bringing everyone involved in that journey, not very top down, but more bottom up in terms of consultation of strategies and direction. We're also seeing very interesting patterns in terms of strategies, and this is what I've written here, defining those objectives. Now, as you know, when companies develop strategies, they're developing those strategic objectives, those priorities. And what we're noticing is that there was the traditional way of doing strategy, which is very planned, very top-down, all about alignment. And you got to just look at the classic companies out there. It's about creating those goals, creating those KPIs, having a sense of direction and scope. And what we're noticing is that the planning mode is becoming challenged more and more by that discovery mode and experimentation mode. And what we're noticing is that strategy is starting to becoming more and more loose. Companies traditionally were sticking to their strategies in a very tight way, and because of volatility, it makes it very difficult for you to innovate. So as a result of that kind of alignment, that traditional model of top-down, it stifled the innovation. And as a result, companies out there are challenging that kind of ExxonMobil approach, that McDonald's style of strategy, to kind of more of that Google approach to strategy making, which is more and more about creating projects, of course doing the milestones accountability, but creating that flexibility into the system. And as a result, what we're seeing is that companies are starting to create opportunities to create more deviation into their business models, opportunities more to experiment and to fail. Some of those companies like 3M that are very experimental and more product-based are starting to adopt this view of creating looser targets to innovate more. And as a result of that, we're starting to see companies create those kind of broad targets, but in some sense not being annoyed if they miss it in some ways, and creating that kind of agility into their structures, which as a result actually is allowing them to be even more profitable in some sense. But as I said to you, this is still early stages, and we're seeing quite interesting shifts happening in terms of flatter hierarchies, faster decisions, and we're starting to see more knowledge management technologies being embedded to create that speed in terms of processing. So what else should we watch more closely? There are lots of tripping hazards out there, but what I want to leave you with is some views here. Now, the traditional way of keeping the workforce engaged was in some ways, there was this intrinsic and extrinsic view, and what we're seeing is that working in a company is not only about money. Of course, the way and the amount you earn motivates you, but those new business models are going beyond just a traditional way of motivating staff. They're going into more of that kind of flexibility approach, allowing you to work from home and creating a more flexible resource base that allows the companies to keep their workforce more engaged in some sense. So motivation now isn't only about the money aspect, but it's also more about, does the company have more social values? Is the company having more of a positive impact on society? We're seeing companies like Tata focus more and more on the kind of, I would say, social aspects of business, motivating the staff not only to focus on the money aspects, but also more about the social impact aspects. So customer intensity is becoming more and more embedded into companies, and without a doubt, what we're noticing more and more in business model shifts and innovations is this concept of customer intensity. So customer intensity is becoming more about personalization, and the companies that I speak to are looking at creating more technologies that create that intensity, that personalization, that trust. And all these companies out there we're talking about are being challenged on how do we maintain customers, how do we instill that trust, how do we make sure that we become still focused on that customer in terms of that level and degree of intensity. So the customer companies out there are becoming a lot more technology orientated in terms of their service, in terms of their product, in terms of creating loyalty, in terms of their sales, in terms of their reputation, in terms of their growth, in terms of their product. So all of these different features are becoming more and more vital for companies to win in their markets. So, you know, these companies are listening 24/7, using all their social platforms, and they're trying to use social analytics to figure out clearly what exactly you want, when you want it, and how you want it as quickly as possible. Those companies like Tesco's, which had some difficulties a few months back, are starting to re-engage, especially with the new leadership of Dave Lewis. We're starting to see very strong strategic priorities of creating more flexibility and agility into their structure in terms of creating more stronger relationships with customers. So kind of my final thoughts before I sum up is that, you know, to compete and win in the future, it's all about thinking about the features of your business model. And what we're seeing is that the coordinations in terms of those activities are shifting. The decision-making structures are shifting and changing. The ways companies define their strategies, direction, and scope is changing. The way companies motivate their employees to create more of an engaged workforce is changing. And we're starting to see more and more companies unbundle some aspects of the value chain, and having scale was once viewed to be a very strong advantage, but because of volatility, which I think is here to stay, we're going to see a lot more volatility coming out from different markets, in different industries, different segments, especially in terms of energy, in terms of weather patterns changing, and as a result of viruses coming in, companies need to think more clearly about agility, flexibility, and the companies that have that degree of adaptation will win. And in the kind of classic words of Darwin, it's not the biggest that will survive, it's the most adaptable. So I think I'll stop there, but I'll finish off with this great slide. It shows you the Pope coming into power in 2005 and the Pope coming into power in 2013. And when you look at these pictures, you can clearly see that in one of those pictures, there was no iPads. There were very, I would say, older generation phones. But now, in that 2013 photo, you're seeing technology drive immense power, and customers are becoming a lot more information driven. And as a result, companies need to think more and more about their business model. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to the questions.
We'll hold on for a few minutes just to allow everyone to send their questions through if they wish. Taz, I wonder how you see the next couple of years, 5 years, developing with technology and on the marketplace? Any foresight in that direction?
So very good question. What I see is, I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this technology called Watson. So Watson is a piece of technology that's been created by IBM, and I think this is going to radically change many industries out there. Cognitive technologies are going to, in many ways, make many jobs redundant. I was recently giving a talk at a event in Moscow, and I told many of the auditors in the room and many of the tax people that you'll be replaced. Many of you here won't have jobs because a lot of strong studies out there are showing that technology will be substituting a huge number of jobs, and the task architecture in many companies 5 years to 10 years down the line will be replaced by technologies. And you know, we just have to go back the last 100 years and look at the different industries and how technology has been substituting many roles and responsibilities. So as a result, what we're seeing is that technology will substitute many of those jobs we previously had, and as a result, that will be quite powerful. We'll see consultants. I was at an event in Vancouver recently, and in Vancouver, the CEO of McKinsey was talking, and he told everybody that McKinsey is changing its business model because of the drastic changes in the way technology will come in and disrupt the way management consulting is done. So McKinsey is becoming a lot more technology orientated. They will still have turnaround specialists, but they will have to become slimmer. They will have to recruit a huge number of PhD students that are technology driven, and as a result of that, we're going to see new markets coming out through social analytics, and as a result of analytics, companies will be evaluating customer data to create more personalization, and supermarkets are going to shift in terms of what you eat and how you eat food, and there will be a lot more degree of personalization in terms of understanding what are the health benefits. We're seeing new industries coming out in terms of nutraceuticals. We're seeing overlaps of industries. You just have to look at your mobile phone and ask the question, 10 years ago, if you were the CEO of Exxon, would you have thought a huge amount of the petrol going into your car would come from retailers? And as a result, retailers are getting a lot more power. If you're making 60 billion a year in terms of revenue, and if you look at Walmart, which had revenues of $440 billion, you start to acknowledge and realize that there are companies out there that will challenge the rules of the game. And I have no doubt that technology, in terms of cognitive technologies, nanotechnologies, all of these types of new forms of technologies will get better. But I also believe we'll see a lot more volatility coming out in terms of different types of attacks, different shocks that will come. I think the euro issue hasn't been solved yet, so we will get lots of flux. But as a result, that will no longer be an excuse, and companies will just have to create agility into their business models to win.
Lovely. And another question, does size preclude agility? And do the 35% Fortune 100 companies give us any lessons?
Absolutely. That's a really good question. I think size was a great way of reducing cost per unit. Being big, of course, in terms of companies, does help your cost structures. You get economies of scale. It allows you to have more customer base. It helps. But it does not help in terms of agility. It's very difficult in terms of flexible responses. So companies out there are daily, challenged. You just have to look at companies out there. I was listening to a talk given by the CEO from Cisco. Cisco's been challenged in their business model. You just have to look at Xerox. They were challenged in their business model. You have to look at the airline industry. You could be Malaysia Airlines, and everything could be quite good in terms of your profitability, and it takes one incident to genuinely damage you. And if you have size, it's difficult. And as a result of that, companies need to have, I would say, structure in terms of managing that size. And I think in the traditional sense, when there was lots of layers, when there was a lot more, I would say, stability in the environment, so the dynamism of the environment was slower, the clock speed of innovation cycles was slower, those big structures were fine. But I think more and more companies are realizing, and we're seeing this in the car industry, you just have to look at the pharmaceutical industry. I have, you know, very strong views on how I see big pharma breaking up in some sense. Many companies out there are challenged in the pharmaceutical industry in terms of, you know, huge budgets in R&D, and as a result, they're looking at creating more agility into their structures. So we're going to see, I think, a lot more delayering. We might see a lot more divestment. We'll see a lot more companies becoming more flexible to manage this volatility, which I think is going to be here. I mean, you just have to look at Nestle, and Nestle CEO says one of the biggest threats to Nestle in terms of you know, difficulties is water, and the CEO perceives water to be a very, very big issue that's going to impact many industries in the next few years. And whether it's energy, whether it's water wars, whether it's some sort of virus, I think Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 100 companies are going to get more and more under stress in terms of thinking of new ways of creating agility.
Lovely. Next question. These days, regulation is a critical part of any strategy. Can technology reduce complexity about regulation, or simply replace regulatory planning the companies are required to do?
That's a fantastic question. You've hit the million-dollar question. Actually, in Cranfield, we're doing very strong research precisely on the topic you talked about and the question that you've asked. I'm currently the director of a new research initiative called the Government Affairs Research Club, and we're holding an event 20th of November at the Institute of Directors, and it's going to have speakers such as the Government Affairs Director of Vodafone, Director of Government Affairs from Diageo, actually he's Head of Policy from Diageo. We're going to have a very senior person coming in from the Cabinet Office talking about the future of regulation and legislation and how technology is going to help to modernize regulation. So I have no doubt at the moment the Cabinet Office, government, 10 Downing Street, whether you go to the US, technology will become more and more embedded into the way we vote, the way we crowdsource ideas, the way we look at policy and optimizing the kind of the policy making process. And I think companies will have more of a say in terms of that. Business government relationships are becoming stronger. We live in a democracy, so I think these conversations will happen. Technology will help. Of course, there's still always going to be problems in terms of companies having their own interests, and then they have to compete with the interests of their competitors. You'll have opponents and proponents, and I think it's going to be an exciting time. If you're interested in joining this conversation, I think you should look at the website on Cranfield, click on Research Clubs, look at the Government Affairs Research Club. We have an event on the 20th of November. If you are interested in this topic, please come and visit us at this event. We're going to have lots of speakers, and it's a way for you to voice your interest if this is a topic that ignited something in your head.
Lovely. Do you have any comment on flexible business models in the context of strict regulatory frameworks and the recent fines seen imposed by countries, regulators, and in group civil suits?
Absolutely, and I think what we're seeing is that actually some of the regulators, and actually this is precisely the topic we'll talk about at this event on 20th of November. Whether you look at Vodafone, whether you look at telecoms industry, whether you look at some digital industries out there, regulations in some sense are a little bit behind. I'll say that again. Regulations out there are a little bit behind some of the management structures and processes that companies are using to manage success. You just have to look at Bitcoin, for example, and how regulations are evolving with this new type of currency. So companies, the way they behave, in some sense, is a benefit in terms of technology orientation, but it also creates complexity that regulators don't understand. Some people have argued, as you know, that the problems we saw in 2007 in terms of the credit crunch, subprime mortgages, a lot of that was down to the speed of technology and how subprime risks and those derivatives could be managed, and technology played a fundamental role in allowing companies to syndicate risk, manage the different types of packages, and I have no doubt technology played a role in some ways to make it difficult for the regulators to stay on top of the game, and as a result, I think regulators know they have to have stronger conversations with companies to better understand what are the needs, what are those challenges, and the conversation has to happen. And I'm glad to tell you that Cranfield is going to play a big role in that conversation through the Government Affairs Research Club and through the different types of government affairs directors within those big companies.
I think we've got a question on shareholders. If shareholder value remains a key focus, will shareholders accept a more fluid approach? And surely shareholders would prefer the certainty derived from fixed goals.
Absolutely. So what I see is that you have long-term shareholders, short-term shareholders, and all the shareholders want to see added value. And they want to see, of course, revenues go up. They want to see sales looking healthy. They want to see a good return on asset, return on sales. So they'll do their ratios, and I think companies out there need to do a bit of both. I don't think if you're a large company, you can go from being a huge company with 50,000 employees or 100,000 employees to changing your structure overnight. Absolutely not. I think it will be a slow process to create the right culture. The corporate culture has to be a high-performance culture. There would have to be, of course, some sort of goals, but I think some companies will have to create flexibility, especially as volatility increases. The more and more we see flux, there will have to be, I would say, broad goals in terms of revenue, sales, but a little bit more agility in terms of the structures, the hierarchy, the coordination activities. I think these kinds of things will have to change, which will make shareholders happy, I think, in many, many ways. But if you are going to be a small company, an innovative company, if you're going to be an Instagram, if you're going to be a company like Instagram, which got bought by Facebook for $1 billion within 362 days, and you only have 12 employees, that's different type of modeling. It requires different types of structures, different types of systems. So I think you raise a very good question. I don't think there's a silver bullet here to answer your question. What I think is that shareholders want to see high return, want to see smarter decisions in terms of investments, but they also want to see companies maintain their advantage and not die, as we've seen from many, many companies out there that had negative shareholder value. So I think, long story short, we're going to see the shifts happening. We're seeing it already. You just have to see UBS Warburg changing their structure, breaking the parts up, dealing with what shareholders wanted. Whether you're in the alcohol industry, whether you're in the tobacco industry, you have to think about changing structures, and I think companies out there are doing it right now as we speak.
Okay, we'll just have a quick check if there's any more questions that come in.
Great. I don't see any questions.
Is that somebody hoping to ask a quick question?
Great. Okay. So I can see a question here from Mike Toft. Is this an example of Schumpeter's creative destruction? That's a great question. Absolutely. I think, when you look at Austrian economists out there, Schumpeter wrote a fantastic book, and I think creative destruction is another example of how we see shifts happening. Entrepreneurship, without a doubt, is driving new ways of management. We're seeing management 2.0, traditional ways of top-down, does work, but we're also seeing many of those companies always being challenged because a huge number of strategies never get executed. And if the facts and the figures show that 85% of strategies don't get executed in a lot of companies, it identifies and shows that new ways of creating focus and management attention is needed. And I think companies are starting to challenge the status quo. And I think Schumpeter's views in terms of innovation cycles, entrepreneurship, is becoming more and more evident. And I think companies out there are going to be using technology a lot more than what they're currently doing. I can just see technology investment shooting up in many of the companies that I speak to. Huge investments are going into kind of knowledge sharing platforms. Huge technology investments are going into making decisions faster. Companies are empowering employees to make decisions faster. So as a result, it's going to be an exciting next 5 years, to be honest. And I think we're going to build on Schumpeter's views, and we're going to see lots of disruptions. Many companies will die, many companies will merge. Many industries out there, whether it's airline sectors, banking sectors, whether it's pharma sectors, we're going to see big shifts, and I think agility is going to be core to that argument. Any other questions? I'll give it one more minute. One more minute. Yeah.
Okay, if we're all set, thank you everybody for joining us, and have a good weekend, and thank you, Taz.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Bye.